Good evening, friend. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Perhaps you're settling in after a long day, the room darkened, except for the soft glow of a dear lamp, or maybe you're watching the last light fade from your window as winter settles in early. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're travelling back to a time when the most powerful throne in Europe wasn't occupied by kings or emperors, but by men who claimed to speak for God himself. We're going to Rome, not the Rome of marble emperors and gladiatorial blood, but the Rome of the Middle Ages, a city often reduced to rubble and ruin, where wild dogs ran through broken forums and cattle grazed in what had once been the heart of civilization. And in this diminished city, inside fortified palaces, sat the popes, the vicars of Christ, the successors to St. Peter, the spiritual fathers of all Christendom. But here's what makes this story so utterly fascinating. Some of these men were anything but holy. They murdered rivals and loved courtesans, they sold salvation and waged war, they had children, sometimes many children, and placed them in positions of power. They threw banquets that would make ancient Romans blush and conducted affairs that scandalized even the most jaded nobility. The very men who were supposed to be closest to God often seemed furthest from any notion of divine grace. How did this happen? How did the chair of St. Peter, that most sacred office in medieval Europe, become occupied by men whose lives read like cautionary tales rather than hagiographies? The answer takes us deep into the machinery of medieval power, into the strange world where spiritual authority and temporal ambition became hopelessly, catastrophically entangled. Picture Rome in the 10th century, what historians would later call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age. The great aqueducts that once brought fresh water to 1 million people had crumbled. The population had collapsed from its ancient height to perhaps 30,000 souls huddled among ruins. Malaria bred in the marshes around the city. Powerful Roman families, the Theophylacts, the Crescentii, the Tusculani, controlled neighbourhoods like warlords, their fortified towers rising above the rubble. The Pope wasn't chosen by cardinals in solemn conclave as he would be in later centuries. No, he was made by whoever controlled the city at that moment, by whoever had the most soldiers, the strongest fortress, the cleverest alliances. And what about the rest of Europe? Kings and emperors across the continent needed the Pope's blessing to legitimize their rule, yet they also feared a Pope with too much independence. The German emperors wanted to control papal elections, the French kings schemed to move the papacy to their own territory. Italian nobles saw the papal throne as the ultimate prize in their endless power struggles. The Pope sat at the centre of a web of competing ambitions, and many who reached that position did so not through piety, but through ruthlessness. This isn't a story about the corruption of an institution. That would be too simple. This is a story about what happens when unlimited spiritual authority meets very human appetites for power, pleasure, and survival. It's about specific men who made specific choices in specific moments. Men whose names have echoed through centuries as warnings and fascinations. Benedict IX, who sold the papacy. John XII, whose orgies in the Lateran Palace became legendary. Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, whose name became synonymous with Renaissance corruption. But it's also a story about the world that produced these men, about why medieval society allowed, sometimes even celebrated, what we would now consider monstrous behaviour from its spiritual leaders. What does it tell us about power, about faith, about the gap between what institutions claim to be and what they actually become? We're going to follow this story chronologically, watching as the papacy transformed from a simple bishopric into the most powerful office in Europe, then seeing how that very power corrupted it, and finally understanding how reformers eventually wrestled it back towards something resembling its founding principles. Along the way, we'll meet murderers and saints, sometimes inhabiting the same body. We'll witness elections that were really kidnappings, ceremonies that masked coups, and religious authority wielded like a weapon. The story spans roughly 5 centuries, from the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the late 9th century to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th. It encompasses the rise and fall of noble houses, the investiture crisis between popes and emperors, the Babylonian captivity at Avignon, and the Western Schism when multiple men claimed to be the true pope simultaneously. It's a sprawling, sometimes bewildering tale, but at its heart are questions that remain urgent. What happens when religious institutions accumulate too much worldly power? How do good systems produce bad leaders? Can an office remain sacred when its occupants are profane? So settle in. Let the day's tensions drain away. We have a long journey ahead, through centuries of scandal and sanctity, through bedrooms and battlefields, through the corridors of the Lateran Palace, where decisions made in darkness shaped the destiny of Europe. Now, let's begin. To understand how the papacy could fall so far, we first need to understand where it began and how high it had risen. The story starts, of course, with Peter, Simon Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, the impetuous disciple who denied Christ 3 times before the cock crowed, then spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for that moment of weakness. According to tradition, Peter travelled to Rome in the years after Christ's crucifixion, established a Christian community in the empire's capital, and was eventually martyred there during Nero's persecutions, crucified upside down because he claimed unworthiness to die as his master had died. Whether all these details are historically accurate matters less than what they established: the belief that Peter had been given special authority by Christ himself. "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," Jesus had said, according to the Gospel of Matthew. The Greek wordplay, Petros meaning Peter, Petra meaning rock, created a foundation myth of tremendous power. Peter wasn't just another apostle, he was the rock, the foundation, and whoever succeeded Peter inherited that authority. For the first few centuries, the Bishop of Rome was simply one important leader among many in the Christian world. The bishops of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople all had their own claims to prestige. Christianity was an underground religion, persecuted and marginal, its bishops more likely to end up in the arena than in palaces. But Rome had advantages. It was the empire's capital, the centre of power and communication. The church there was wealthy, supporting Christian communities across the Mediterranean, and it had Peter's tomb, or claim to, which amounted to the same thing. Everything changed in 313 when Constantine legalized Christianity, and then again when Theodosius made it the empire's official religion in 380. Suddenly, bishops weren't outlaws but power brokers. They didn't hide in catacombs, but presided over magnificent basilicas built with imperial funds. The Bishop of Rome began to be called Papa, Pope, a title that meant father. He started to claim authority not just over the Roman Church, but over all Christians everywhere. This claim met resistance. The Eastern bishops, especially the Patriarch of Constantinople, had no intention of subordinating themselves to Rome. They had their own traditions, their own languages, their own theological positions. The Roman Pope might be first among equals, they conceded, but he certainly wasn't their supreme ruler. This tension between East and West would eventually split Christianity into Catholic and Orthodox branches, but that schism lay centuries ahead. In the West, however, the Pope's authority grew steadily. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, when Germanic tribes carved up the provinces and the emperor in Ravenna became a powerless figurehead, the Pope remained. Pope Leo XIII had faced down Attila the Hun in 452, convincing him to spare Rome. Pope Gregory I, who reigned from 590 to 604, essentially governed Rome when imperial administration had vanished, organising food distribution, negotiating with Lombard invaders, and sending missionaries to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons in Britain. Gregory was a fascinating figure, an aristocrat who became a monk, a reluctant administrator who transformed the papacy into something approaching a temporal state. He reformed church music, Gregorian chant bears his name, systematized church administration, and wrote theological works that would influence medieval thought for centuries. He also established the medieval papacy's tone, ascetic yet pragmatic, spiritually focused yet politically shrewd. The Lombards controlled much of Italy, threatening Rome constantly. The Byzantine Empire technically claimed Italy, but couldn't protect it. The Pope needed a protector. In the 8th century, he found one in the Franks. Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps in 754 to meet with Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, and made a deal. Pepin would defend Rome and give the Pope control of central Italy, the donation of Pepin, creating the Papal States. In exchange, the Pope legitimized Pepin's dynasty, anointing him king and establishing that papal approval was necessary for royal authority. This exchange, military protection for spiritual legitimization, would define the medieval papacy. Kings needed the Pope to make them legitimate. The Pope needed kings to keep him safe and powerful. But what happened when their interests diverged? The arrangement reached its height on Christmas Day 800, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. The Roman Empire, dead in the West for 3 centuries, was reborn, or so the ceremony claimed. Charlemagne now ruled from the North Sea to Rome, from the Atlantic to Hungary. He was the first Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope had made him so. But there was a problem embedded in this triumph. By crowning Charlemagne, Leo established that the Pope could make emperors, but didn't that also imply that the Pope could unmake them? That spiritual authority stood above temporal power? Charlemagne himself didn't see it that way. He considered himself God's chosen ruler, and the Pope merely a useful priest who provided the ceremony. Would poison European politics for centuries. After Charlemagne died in 814, his empire fragmented. His grandsons divided it into 3 kingdoms through the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Central authority collapsed. Local strongmen seized power. Vikings raided from the north, Muslims from the south, Magyars from the east. The 9th century was a time of terrible violence and instability. And Rome? Rome fell into the hands of its local nobility. These families, ancient names with new fortunes built on war and intimidation, saw the papacy not as a sacred trust but as a prize to be won. Control the Pope, and you controlled access to heaven itself. You could excommunicate your enemies, legitimize your children's marriages into higher nobility, grant yourself lucrative church offices. The papacy became a commodity, bought and sold, seized and defended, with swords. The stage was set for the Dark Age that was coming. The late 9th and early 10th centuries introduced a new dynamic to the papacy, one that would poison it for generations. Noble families began treating the papal office as family property, something to be controlled, inherited, and exploited. The Theophylact family led the way. Theophylactus was a Roman noble who held the title of Vestararius, essentially the chief financial officer of the papal court. But his real power came from his wife Theodora and their daughter Marozia. These 2 women, more than any document or law, controlled Rome for decades. Theodora was, by all accounts, extraordinary, beautiful, intelligent, utterly ruthless. She didn't just influence popes. According to contemporary sources, she made them and unmade them as it suited her purposes. The historian Liutprand of Cremona, writing a generation later with obvious misogynistic relish, claimed she installed her lovers as popes. Whether literally true or not, the accusation reveals how completely the Theophylacts dominated Rome. Her daughter Marozia inherited this appetite for power and refined it. As a teenager, Marozia became the mistress of Pope Sergius III, who reigned from 904 to 911. She bore him a son. This child, named John, would eventually become Pope Benedict IX, creating the extraordinary situation of a pope who was the son of a pope. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's understand how papal elections have become so corrupted. In theory, the Pope was elected by the clergy and people of Rome, a practice dating back to early Christianity. In reality, by the 10th century, whoever controlled Rome's fortresses and soldiers controlled the election. Sometimes there were genuine elections, with competing factions putting forward candidates. More often, the outcome was determined by whichever noble family could intimidate or bribe the most electors. The Theophylacts were masters of this game. Through the early 10th century, they ensured that their allies, relatives, or dependents occupied the papal throne. Pope John Net, the 914 to 928, was one of Theodora's appointments, possibly her lover, according to Liutprand, though he seems to have made this claim about every pope of the era. John Nix was actually a capable administrator and military leader, who organised Italian forces to defeat a Muslim raiding base at Corigliano. But when he tried to assert independence from the Theophylacts, Marozia had him arrested, imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, and probably murdered, smothered with a pillow according to one account. She replaced him with Leo VI, who lasted 4 months before dying, then Stephen VII, who lasted 2 years. These were placeholder popes, men chosen for their weakness and malleability. They enacted no reforms, left no mark on history. They were simply there to warm the throne while Marozia consolidated power. Then in 931, Marozia made her boldest move. She installed her own son, John, as Pope John XI. He was in his early 20s, possibly younger. His qualifications for the papacy consisted entirely of being Marozia's child. She didn't even bother to hide the arrangement. She openly controlled church appointments, enriched herself through church revenues, and ran Rome as her personal domain. She made one mistake. She remarried. Her new husband was Hugh of Italy, an ambitious nobleman who saw marriage to Marozia as a path to controlling Rome. But Marozia's son from her first marriage, Alberic II, hated Hugh. At the wedding feast in Castel Sant'Angelo, an argument erupted. Accounts differ on the details, but it seems Hugh slapped or insulted the young Alberic. In response, Alberic incited a riot. The Roman mob stormed the fortress. Hugh barely escaped by sliding down a rope from a window. Marozia was imprisoned by her own son and disappeared from history, presumably dying in captivity. Alberic II then ruled Rome as princeps, Prince of the Romans, for more than 20 years. But here's what's remarkable. He was actually competent. He reformed monastic discipline, supported learning, maintained order. He kept his half-brother John XI as pope, but stripped him of all temporal power. The pope could say mass, ordain priests, and manage church ritual, but Alberic ruled. This created a strange new model. The papacy divided between spiritual and temporal authority, with the temporal power completely dominating. The pope became almost a figurehead, important for ceremonies but politically neutered. It worked, after a fashion, as long as Alberic lived. But Alberic made a fatal decision. As he lay dying in 954, he made the Roman nobles swear that they would elect his son Octavian as the next pope. Octavian was about 18 years old, more interested in hunting and women than theology. When Pope Agapetus II died in 955, the Romans kept their oath. Octavian became pope, taking the name John XII. This was different from John XI. Marozia's son had been dominated by his mother and then his half-brother. Octavian dominated Rome himself. He held both spiritual and temporal authority, prince and pope. He was young, handsome, energetic, and convinced of his own magnificence. He was also, by the standards of any era, a disaster. John XII threw legendary banquets in the Lateran Palace, the papal residence. He gambled with church revenues. He allegedly ordained a 10-year-old boy as bishop. He had numerous affairs. The chronicles specifically mention a woman named Stephana and another named Rhaenera, widow of his vassal. He turned the sacred palace into what critics called a brothel. The historian Liutprand, who hated John, claimed he toasted the devil and invoked pagan gods while throwing dice. This may be exaggeration, but even allowing for bias, John XII's behaviour was extraordinary. He also made dangerous political decisions. Threatened by Berengar of Italy, John invited the German king Otto to invade Italy and claim the imperial crown. Otto came south in 961, was crowned emperor in 962, and then realised what kind of man had crowned him. Otto was a pious, serious ruler appalled by John's lifestyle. He convened a church council to investigate the pope. The charges brought against John XII included ordaining a deacon in a stable, consecrating a 10-year-old as bishop, committing adultery with multiple women including his father's concubine, blinding his spiritual advisor Benedict, castor, rating and killing a cardinal, hunting publicly, appearing in armour, and failing to celebrate matins and vespers or make the sign of the cross. The witnesses were credible, cardinal bishops and deacons of Rome itself. John XII fled Rome before the council could depose him, taking the papal treasury with him. Otto installed a new pope, Leo VIII, but when Otto left Rome, John returned with an army, drove out Leo, and took savage revenge on those who'd testified against him. He had the most prominent Cardinal Deacon John mutilated, his right hand cut off, his nose and tongue cut out. Others were executed or exiled. John's counterattack was short-lived. In May 964, he died suddenly. The official cause was a stroke, but rumours immediately spread that he'd been caught in bed with a married woman and her husband had beaten him to death, or that the devil himself had killed him, or that the woman's relatives had thrown him from a window. The truth is lost, but the legend persisted. The scandalous Pope had died in scandal. His death changed nothing. The Roman nobility simply installed another of their creatures. The pattern was established. The papacy had become a prize in Italian politics, a tool of noble families, an office held by men who had no calling except ambition. This was the foundation upon which the medieval papacy's worst excesses would be built. After John XII, you might think the papacy would have reformed itself, that the sheer scandal of his reign would have provoked change. Instead, things got worse. The German emperors tried to control papal elections, installing their own candidates. The Roman nobility resisted, installing theirs. Sometimes there were 2 or even 3 rival popes at once, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of Peter, each excommunicating the others. How do you navigate such a situation if you're an ordinary Christian? Which pope's commands do you follow? Which sacraments are valid? The Crescentii family rose to dominance in Rome after Alberic's line died out. John Crescentius controlled the city in the 980s and 990s, manipulating papal elections. When the German Emperor Otto III came to Rome in 996, he deposed the Crescentii Pope and installed his own cousin as Gregory V, the first German Pope, only 24 years old. But when Otto left Italy, John Crescentius drove out Gregory and installed an anti-pope, John XVI. Otto returned with an army in 998. The revenge he took was medieval in its brutality. John XVI was captured, blinded, had his nose and ears cut off, his tongue torn out, and was paraded through Rome backward on a donkey before being imprisoned for the rest of his life. John Crescentius was beheaded, his body hung from the battlements of Castel Sant'Angelo. Gregory V was restored, but died in 9999, possibly poisoned. Otto then made an extraordinary choice. He installed his former tutor, Gerbert of Aurillac, as Pope Sylvester II. Gerbert was the most learned man in Europe, a mathematician and astronomer, a scholar who had studied in Muslim Spain and introduced Arabic numerals to Christian Europe. He was brilliant, pious, capable, everything a pope should be. But he was also Otto's creature, installed by imperial power, distrusted by the Romans. When Otto died unexpectedly in 1002, Gerbert's protection vanished. He died in 1003, possibly driven out of Rome, possibly poisoned. His brief reign showed that even brilliance and learning couldn't fix a broken system. After Gerbert came a succession of popes so obscure that some of their names have been confused or disputed by historians. John VII lasted 5 months. John VIII lasted 5 years but was forced to abdicate and became a monk. Sergius IV lasted 2 years. What did any of them actually do? The records are sparse. They seem to have administered sacraments, appointed bishops where they could, and tried to survive. Then came the Tusculani family and their pope, Benedict IX. Benedict IX is perhaps the most notorious pope in history. He was the son of Alberic III, Count of Tusculum, and he was installed as pope in 1032 when he was somewhere between 18 and 20 years old, possibly as young as 12, though this seems unlikely. His family essentially bought the papacy for him, the way you might buy a commission in the army for a useless son. Benedict's reign, or rather, reigns since he was pope 3 separate times, was chaotic. He allegedly conducted orgies in the Lateran Palace. He was accused of rape, murder, and every vice imaginable. But we need to be careful here. Benedict had powerful enemies, and medieval chroniclers loved to pile on scandalous details. Some of what we know about Benedict comes from sources written decades after his death, by reformers who wanted to emphasize how corrupt the papacy had become before they fixed it. Was Benedict really as bad as they claimed? Probably not. Was he bad? Almost certainly yes. What we know for certain is that Benedict's reign was turbulent. In 1036, he faced a revolt in Rome and was driven out. He returned with his family's army and reclaimed the papacy. Then in 1044, he was driven out again by another faction that installed Sylvester III. Benedict returned 3 months later and deposed Sylvester. Then Benedict did something unprecedented. He decided to get married. The problem was, you can't be both pope and married. So in May 1045, Benedict sold the papacy to his godfather, John Gratian, who became Gregory VI. The price was reportedly £1,000 or £2,000 of gold, a fortune. Gregory VI was actually a reformer, a pious man who'd bought the papacy specifically to remove Benedict from it. But the transaction itself was simony, buying or selling church office, one of the worst sins in canon law. So Gregory's reign, though well-intentioned, was fundamentally illegitimate. Meanwhile, Benedict apparently regretted his decision. By November 1045, he was claiming the papacy again. So Rome now had 3 living men claiming to be pope: Benedict IX, Sylvester III, and Gregory VI. It was an impossible situation. The German king Henry III came to Italy to sort out the mess. He convened the Synod of Sutri in December 1046, which deposed all 3 rival popes. Henry then appointed his own candidate, a German bishop who became Clement II. Clement crowned Henry as emperor, linking the German monarchy to papal reform. But Benedict IX wasn't finished. When Clement II died in 1047, possibly poisoned, Benedict seized Rome for a 3rd time and reigned again for 8 months, before being driven out by Henry III's forces. He finally gave up in 1048 and disappeared into obscurity, dying around 1055. Benedict IX's extraordinary career, 3 separate reigns, selling the papacy, getting married, multiple depositions, exemplified everything wrong with the medieval papacy. The office created to preserve Christian unity had become a commodity. The keys to heaven were controlled by whichever Italian or German faction could field the most soldiers. But Benedict's chaos also provoked a reaction. By demonstrating so thoroughly how corrupt the system had become, he inadvertently sparked the reform movement that would eventually transform the papacy. The German emperors, the reforming monks of Cluny, and eventually a generation of remarkable popes would work to restore legitimacy and authority to the office. The foundation of dysfunction was complete. Now came the long struggle to build something better on top of those ruins. Here's one of history's strange paradoxes. The very chaos and corruption of the 10th and early 11th centuries provoked a reform movement that would eventually make the papacy more powerful than it had ever been. The scandals we've been exploring weren't the end of the papal story. They were, in a sense, the beginning of its greatest age. The reforms began not in Rome, but in monasteries, particularly Cluny and Burgundy. Founded in 910, Cluny operated under a revolutionary principle. It answered directly to the Pope, not to local bishops or nobles. This made it independent from the local power structures that had corrupted so much of the Church. Cluniac monasteries spread across Europe, creating a network of institutions that took reform seriously: strict observance of monastic rules, celibacy, resistance to lay interference in church affairs. These monks, and the bishops they trained, began articulating a vision of church reform that had several key elements. First, celibacy for all clergy. In the early medieval period, many priests were married or kept concubines. This was seen as natural. Why shouldn't a priest have a family? But it created problems. Priests passed church property to their children, treating parishes as inherited estates. Reformers argued that celibacy would keep church property in church hands and keep clergy focused on spiritual rather than dynastic concerns. Second, an end to simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This practice had become endemic. Noble families purchased bishoprics for their younger sons. Kings sold church appointments to raise money. The reformers declared this unacceptable, a sin against the Holy Spirit. Third, and most revolutionary, the church should control its own affairs. Bishops should be elected by clergy, not appointed by kings. The Pope should be chosen by cardinals, not installed by emperors or Roman nobles. This principle, called libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church, would transform European politics. These ideas found powerful advocates in a series of German popes installed by Henry III after the deposition of Benedict IX. These men, Clement II, Damasus II, Leo IX, and Victor II, were genuine reformers, working to restore dignity and discipline to the church. Leo IX, who reigned from 1049 to 1054, was particularly important. He travelled constantly, holding synods across Europe to condemn simony and clerical marriage, deposing corrupt bishops, reorganising church administration. Leo also expanded the College of Cardinals, transforming it from a mostly ceremonial body of Roman clergy into an international assembly of the Church's most capable administrators. These cardinals would eventually gain the exclusive right to elect popes, removing the papacy from local Roman politics. But the reform movement's success created a new problem. If the Church was independent from secular authority, who held supreme power in Christian Europe? This question came to a head during the reign of Pope Gregory VII. Hildebrand Aldobrandeschi, who became Gregory VII in 1073, was a small, intense man with absolute convictions. He'd been a key figure in the reform movement for decades, serving as an advisor to previous popes, essentially running church administration while older men wore the papal tiara. When he finally became pope himself, he was ready to push reform to its logical conclusion. It consisted of 27 brief installments asserting papal supremacy. Some were uncontroversial. The Pope is the only person whose feet all princes should kiss. The Pope can be judged by no one. Others were revolutionary. The Pope can depose emperors. The Pope can absolve subjects from their oaths of allegiance to wicked rulers. This was a direct challenge to secular authority. For centuries, kings and emperors had claimed to rule by divine right, answerable only to God. Now the Pope was saying, no, you rule because the Church legitimizes you, and we can remove that legitimization. The German Emperor Henry IV wasn't about to accept this. He'd been appointing bishops throughout his realm, treating them as royal administrators. Gregory's response was unprecedented. He excommunicated and deposed Henry. The Pope declared that the emperor was no longer emperor, that all Christians were released from their oaths to obey him. This created chaos in Germany. Henry's enemies, including many German nobles who'd been waiting for an opportunity to rebel, suddenly had papal permission to do so. They told Henry that if he didn't receive absolution from the Pope within a year, they would elect a new king. Henry found himself with no choice but to submit. In January 1077, Henry travelled to Canossa in northern Italy, where Gregory was staying in a castle. Henry waited outside in the snow for 3 days, barefoot, dressed in penitential clothing, begging for forgiveness. Finally, Gregory had to relent. As a priest, he couldn't refuse to absolve a penitent sinner. Henry was restored to the church and to his throne. Canossa became one of the most famous moments in medieval history, the image of the emperor standing barefoot in the snow, symbolizing the church's triumph over secular power. But the reality was more complex. Henry had submitted tactically, not spiritually. Once absolved, he returned to Germany, defeated his enemies and invaded Italy. In 1084, Henry's army captured Rome. But Gregory's defeat was temporary. The principles he'd fought for, papal supremacy, church independence, the power to judge and depose secular rulers, would define the next 2 centuries. His successors continued the reforms. Papal authority grew steadily. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, but a political power who could topple dynasties. The investiture controversy, as this conflict came to be called, was eventually settled by the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The compromise was complex, but essentially, the Church would elect bishops, but the emperor could have some input. Bishops would receive their spiritual authority from the Pope, but their temporal lands from the emperor. Neither side got everything it wanted, but both could claim victory. More importantly, the Church had established itself as an independent power. The papacy now had its own bureaucracy, its own revenue system, its own law courts. Canon law, church law, became sophisticated and extensive, governing everything from marriage to contracts. If you had a dispute, you could choose between the king's court and the church court. Often people chose the church court because it was more efficient and predictable. The 12th century saw the papacy reach extraordinary heights. A series of able popes, Urban Dick, Pascal II, Alexander III, navigated European politics skillfully. They built alliances, played kingdoms off against each other, established Rome as the centre not just of spiritual authority, but of international diplomacy. The Crusades enhanced papal prestige enormously. When Pope Urban VIII called for the First Crusade in 1095, tens of thousands of people responded, crossing Europe to fight for Jerusalem. The Pope had mobilized an army with just words. No king could claim such power. Subsequent crusades, though often failures militarily, reinforced the idea that the Pope was Christianity's leader, the person who could call believers to action. But power, as we've already seen, corrupts. And the very success of the reform movement, the very expansion of papal authority, would create new opportunities for scandal. Let's talk about how things actually worked, the practical machinery of the medieval papacy at its height, and how that machinery could be manipulated. By the late 12th century, the papacy had evolved into a sophisticated governmental system. At its heart was the papal curia, the Pope's court and administrative centre. The curia included the College of Cardinals, who advised the Pope and elected his successor, the various chancelleries that produced documents, the courts that heard legal appeals from across Europe, and the financial offices that managed the Church's immense wealth. The Pope himself was elected by the cardinals meeting in conclave, practice formalised in 1059 and refined over subsequent decades. The cardinals were locked in a room until they reached a decision, with their living conditions deliberately degraded to encourage quick resolution. This system removed papal elections from the immediate control of Roman mobs and noble families, but it created new opportunities for manipulation. Cardinals could be bribed, threatened, or pressured by kings and powerful families. Once elected, a pope found himself at the centre of a vast revenue system. The Church's income came from multiple sources. There were the Papal States, territories in central Italy that the Pope ruled directly as a temporal prince, collecting taxes and administering justice. There were Peter's pence, contributions sent by various kingdoms. England, for instance, sent an annual tribute. There were fees for papal services. If you wanted the Pope to grant a dispensation for marriage within prohibited degrees of kinship, you paid. If you wanted papal confirmation of a bishop's election, you paid. If you wanted a papal letter supporting your monastery's independence from the local bishop, you paid. The most controversial revenue source was indulgences. The theory behind indulgences was sophisticated. Sin had two consequences: eternal punishment, hell, and temporal punishment, purgatory. Confession and absolution removed the eternal punishment, but you still owed temporal punishment. The Church, however, had access to the treasury of merit, the excess goodness of Christ and the saints. The Pope could draw on this treasury and apply it to your debt, reducing your time in purgatory. This was an indulgence. In principle, indulgences were spiritual transactions. In practice, they became financial ones. You donated to the Church, and you received an indulgence. The line between donation and purchase blurred and eventually disappeared. By the late medieval period, professional pardoners travelled Europe selling indulgences, promising reduced purgatory time in exchange for money. This would eventually provoke the Protestant Reformation, but we're not there yet. The papal bureaucracy grew enormous. By the 13th century, hundreds of clerks worked in Rome, copying documents, maintaining records, processing appeals. This bureaucracy needed money to function, creating pressure to increase revenues. More fees, more taxes, more demands on local churches. The college system for cardinals also evolved. Cardinals were no longer just advisors. They became princes of the Church, each with their own household, their own income, their own political interests. When a cardinal died, his property reverted to the Pope, creating a perverse incentive. Some popes preferred elderly, wealthy cardinals who would die quickly and enrich the papal treasury. Cardinals were supposed to advise the Pope impartially, but they often represented particular factions or kingdoms. The French kings ensured that multiple French cardinals were always in the college. The Italian noble families, Orsini, Colonna, Conti, treated cardinalates as family property. Spanish kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire, even Poland and Hungary worked to place their candidates in the college. This meant that papal elections were intensely political. Cardinals formed alliances, made deals, and engaged in what we'd now call lobbying. Sometimes elections took months or even years. The longest papal election in history lasted nearly 3 years, from 1268 to 1271, as the cardinals deadlocked between French and Italian factions. The people of Viterbo, where the cardinals were meeting, eventually locked them in the papal palace, removed the roof and put them on bread and water to force a decision. Once elected, popes faced constant financial pressure. The papal states needed defending against Italian neighbours. Crusades needed funding. The bureaucracy needed maintaining. Cardinals expected lavish gifts and appointments for their relatives. Popes borrowed constantly, often from Italian banking families like the Bardi or Medici, using future church revenues as collateral. This created a cycle. Popes needed money, so they increased fees and taxes. Local clergy resented these demands and sometimes refused to pay. Popes responded by granting more exemptions and privileges to those who would pay. This further increased resentment among those excluded. By the 14th century, the system was straining under its own weight. Nepotism became endemic. The word itself comes from nepote, so Italian for nephew, or grandson, or any young male relative. Popes appointed their nephews to lucrative church positions, made them cardinals, gave them palaces and revenues. Sometimes these nephews were actually illegitimate sons. The convenient fiction that a prelate's child was his nephew allowed everyone to maintain appearances. Some papal nephews were competent administrators who had been trained for their roles. Others were wastrels who bankrupted their offices through gambling and extravagance. It varied by pope and nephew, but the practice eroded the principle that church office should go to the most qualified, the most pious, the most capable. Instead, it went to family. The chancery system for documents created more opportunities for manipulation. Papal bulls, formal letters sealed with the Pope's lead seal or bulla, had immense authority. They could overturn local decisions, grant privileges, excommunicate enemies. But obtaining a bull required navigating the bureaucracy, paying fees, often bribing officials. Skilled lawyers in Rome made fortunes helping clients obtain favourable papal decisions. Sometimes documents were forged. The most famous example is the donation of Constantine, a document claiming that Emperor Constantine had given the Pope authority over all of Western Europe in the 4th century. This document was accepted as genuine for centuries and used to justify papal territorial claims. Only in the 15th century did humanist scholars prove it was an 8th or 9th century forgery. How many other forged documents circulated, granting privileges and authorities that had no legitimate basis, we'll never know. The machinery of papal government, in other words, was sophisticated and powerful, but also corrupt and corruptible. It created enormous opportunities for those who knew how to work the system. And when that system was headed by a pope who was himself corrupt, the possibilities for abuse multiplied exponentially. By the early 13th century, the medieval papacy reached its absolute zenith under Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216. If you wanted to understand papal power at its peak, when it seemed permanent, invincible, ordained by God himself, you would study Innocent's reign. Lothario de' Conti was only 37 when elected pope, taking the name Innocent III. He was brilliant, educated in theology and law, politically shrewd, and absolutely convinced of papal supremacy. The Pope, Innocent made clear, stood between God and humanity, lower than God but higher than man. Innocent's achievements were staggering. He brought the papal states under effective papal control, crushing rebellious nobles and establishing firm administration. He organised the Fourth Crusade, which, admittedly, went disastrously wrong when the Crusaders sacked Christian Constantinople instead of reclaiming Jerusalem, but the fact remains that Innocent could mobilise such an effort. He called the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the largest church council of the Middle Ages, which enacted sweeping reforms to discipline and doctrine. But more than any specific achievement, Innocent exemplified papal political power. When King John of England resisted Innocent's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury, Innocent placed all of England under interdict, essentially suspending normal church functions throughout the realm. No church bells rang, no marriages were celebrated, no one was buried in consecrated ground. John held out for years, but eventually the pressure grew unbearable. In 1213, John surrendered completely, declaring himself Innocent's vassal and agreeing to hold England as a papal fief. The King of England, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, had become the Pope's subordinate. Innocent intervened in the succession disputes of nearly every major European kingdom. He crowned and deposed emperors. He adjudicated the disputed French royal succession. He claimed that princes derived their authority from the papacy, as the moon derives its light from the sun. This wasn't mere rhetoric. Innocent made it real. The church's machinery hummed with efficiency. Innocent's bureaucracy processed thousands of legal appeals annually. His financial officers collected revenues from across Christendom. His diplomatic letters reached from Ireland to Jerusalem. Rome was truly the centre of European civilization, and the Pope was its undisputed master. Even Innocent's crusades against heretics demonstrated papal power. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy in southern France wasn't just a military campaign, but an assertion of theological authority. The Pope could declare who was and wasn't a proper Christian, and could call armies to enforce that declaration. Thousands died in this crusade. The massacre at Béziers in 1209, where crusaders reportedly killed up to 20,000 people, remains one of medieval history's darkest moments. After Innocent came a succession of capable 13th century popes who maintained this high level of authority. Gregory IX, 1227 to 1241, established the Papal Inquisition, systematizing the investigation and punishment of heresy. Innocent IV, 1243 to 1254, claimed explicitly that the Pope held authority over all people, Christian or not, that papal power was truly universal. But the very height of papal power contained the seeds of its decline. The claims kept escalating, each pope trying to assert more authority than his predecessor, until they became unsustainable. If the pope claimed authority over everything, then every problem became the pope's problem. If every dispute could be appealed to Rome, the system would drown in cases. If the pope could depose any ruler, then every ruler had to treat the pope as an enemy. The fundamental contradiction was this: spiritual authority and temporal power operate by different rules. Spiritual authority depends on moral credibility. Temporal power depends on force. The more the papacy acted like a temporal power, taxing, waging war, playing diplomatic games, the more it eroded its spiritual credibility. The conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France demonstrated this perfectly. Boniface, who reigned from 1294 to 1303, was the last pope to seriously claim Innocent III's level of universal authority. This was the most extreme statement of papal supremacy ever made. Philip IV wasn't impressed. He was building a modern nation-state in France, centralizing authority, creating a professional bureaucracy. He needed revenue, and he taxed the French church. When Boniface objected, Philip responded with propaganda, sending agents throughout France to denounce the Pope as a heretic, a sorcerer, a sodomite. The conflict escalated until September 1303, when Philip's agents, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, travelled to Avignon where Boniface was staying. They broke into the papal palace with local allies and confronted the elderly Pope. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, whether Boniface was physically assaulted, whether Nogaret actually slapped him, the famous slap at Avignon, but the symbolism was clear. The Pope, who claimed authority over all Christian rulers, was helpless before French power. Boniface was rescued by locals after 3 days and returned to Rome, but died within a month, possibly from shock at his treatment. The slap at Avignon marked a turning point. Never again would a medieval pope wield the kind of authority Innocent III had exercised. The age of papal supremacy was over, though it would take decades for this to become fully apparent. The machinery that Innocent III had perfected, the bureaucracy, the legal system, the revenue collection, the diplomatic networks, all remained in place. But the moral authority that made the machinery effective was evaporating. Popes would continue to make grand claims, but increasingly no one was listening. After Boniface VIII's death and humiliation, the papacy entered a period that contemporaries called the Babylonian captivity, a reference to the ancient Israelites' exile in Babylon. For nearly 70 years, from 1309 to 1376, the popes didn't rule from Rome, but from Avignon in southern France. How did this happen? After Boniface's death, the cardinals elected Benedict XI, who reigned for only 8 months before dying, possibly poisoned, though this was claimed about many medieval popes. The conclave to elect his successor deadlocked for 11 months between pro-French and pro-Italian factions. Finally, in June 1305, they compromised on a French archbishop, Bertrand de Got, who became Clement V. Clement never came to Rome. He was crowned in Lyon, moved his court to various French cities, and eventually settled in Avignon in 1309. His reasons were partly practical. Italy was in chaos, with Rome torn between the Orsini and Colonna families, the streets dangerous for anyone, let alone a pope. But the decision was also political. Clement was French, his cardinals were increasingly French, and the French king wanted the pope where he could control him. Avignon wasn't technically in France, it was in the Kingdom of Arles, technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, though the papacy would later purchase it outright. But it was right on the French border, French-speaking, and within easy reach of French power. The popes claimed they were in Avignon temporarily, until Rome became safe again. The temporary stay lasted 7 decades. During this period, the papacy reached new heights of administrative sophistication and new depths of financial corruption. The Avignon popes built an enormous palace complex, essentially a fortress, that still dominates the city. They created a bureaucracy that made the 13th century curia look primitive. The papal administration employed hundreds of clerks, notaries, lawyers, and financial officers. Documents were copied in multiple exemplars, filed, indexed, and stored. The archive grew enormous. This bureaucracy existed to extract money. The Avignon popes perfected every form of church taxation. Annates, the first year's income from any church office, became mandatory papal revenue. Expectatives allowed people to pay for the right to the next vacant beneficee in a particular area. Provisions gave the Pope the right to directly appoint to church positions, bypassing local elections, and of course those appointed paid fees. The system of indulgences expanded dramatically. Papal collectors travelled Europe offering reduced purgatory time in exchange for donations. The theology became increasingly transactional, so much money for so many days off purgatory. The actual spiritual dimension, contrition, confession, amendment of life, became almost incidental. John XII, who reigned from 1316 to 1334, was particularly aggressive. He was a brilliant administrator and a theological innovator. He advanced controversial ideas about the beatific vision that almost got him declared a heretic. He was also obsessed with money. His financial officials developed new revenue streams, new fees, new taxes. By his death, John had accumulated an enormous treasury. Estimates suggest 750,000 gold florins, plus jewels and precious objects. This was more wealth than most kingdoms could claim, but this wealth came at a cost. The church's reputation suffered tremendously. People across Europe complained about papal taxation, about money flowing to Avignon while local churches fell into disrepair. The English Parliament periodically passed laws limiting papal taxation and jurisdiction. Kings increasingly refused papal demands. The Avignon Papacy also became notorious for nepotism and luxury. The papal court was magnificent. Lavish banquets, beautiful manuscripts, sophisticated art patronage. The popes and cardinals lived like princes, which they effectively were. Many kept mistresses despite clerical celibacy rules. Cardinals built palaces that rivaled royal residences. The contrast between Christ's poverty and papal wealth became impossible to ignore. Petrarch, the great Italian poet and humanist, lived near Avignon and wrote scathing denunciations. He called it the Babylon of the West, a place of greed, corruption, and spiritual bankruptcy. He described cardinals riding in silk robes on horses with golden saddles, attended by armies of servants, living in palaces where prostitutes came and went freely. Were these descriptions accurate or exaggerated? Probably both. Petrarch had an axe to grind. He was Italian and wanted the Pope back in Rome, but his complaints resonated because they captured something real. The Avignon Papacy had become a machine for extracting wealth and distributing privileges, and the spiritual mission seemed secondary. The French domination of the papacy also caused political problems. Between 1305 and 1378, all 7 Avignon popes were French. Of the 134 cardinals created during this period, 113 were French. This meant the papacy appeared to be, and often functioned as, an instrument of French foreign policy. When England and France entered the 100 Years' War in 1337, how could English Christians trust a French pope? When the Pope excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor, was that a spiritual judgment or French political manoeuvring? Critics emerged from within the Church itself. William of Ockham, the famous philosopher, argued that the Pope could be wrong, even heretical, and that a general council of the Church might have authority superior to any individual Pope. Marsilius of Padua went further, arguing that all authority ultimately came from the people, not from God through the Pope. These ideas were declared heretical, but they spread anyway, especially among those resentful of papal power. The Italian poet Dante, writing his Divine Comedy in the early 1300s, placed several popes in hell. He put Boniface VIII, still alive when Dante wrote that section, in the circle reserved for simoniacs, those who bought and sold church offices, buried upside down in holes with their feet on fire. Dante's vision of corrupt popes suffering eternal punishment captured the popular imagination. People were losing faith not just in individual popes, but in the institution itself. Rome, meanwhile, declined into ruin without the papal court. The city's population shrank to perhaps 20,000. Palaces and churches crumbled. Cattle grazed in the Forum. Bandits controlled the countryside around the city. The great basilicas, St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, Santa Maria Maggiore, fell into disrepair, their roofs leaking, their treasures stolen or sold. The Roman people sent desperate pleas to Avignon. Come back, restore the city, be the Bishop of Rome instead of the King of Avignon. The popes made vague promises but never came. Why would they? Avignon was comfortable, secure and rich. Rome was dangerous, impoverished, and full of uncontrollable nobles. But voices within the church began arguing that the Pope's absence from Rome was itself illegitimate. Peter had been martyred in Rome. The Pope was the Bishop of Rome. How could he be the Bishop of Rome while living in France? The longer the absence continued, the more this argument gained traction. St. Catherine of Siena, a mystic and visionary, took up the cause with fierce conviction. She wrote letters to Pope Gregory XI, urging him to return to Rome, calling him to courage and holiness. Her letters mixed profound respect for the papal office with blunt criticism of papal behaviour. "Be a courageous man for me and not a coward," she wrote. Other factors also pushed toward return. The 100 Years' War made France itself increasingly unstable. French defeats meant the French king could offer less protection to Avignon. Italian city-states had grown wealthy and powerful during the papal absence. They now wanted the prestige and economic benefits of hosting the papacy. Cardinals who weren't French resented French domination and saw return to Rome as a way to break French control. In 1367, Pope Urban V actually did return to Rome, making a triumphal entry into the city. For 3 years it seemed the exile was over, but Urban found Rome as chaotic as ever. The nobility fought in the streets, his reforms met resistance, the buildings were ruins. In 1370 Urban fled back to Avignon, where he died a few months later. But the idea had been planted. The Pope could return, Rome could be restored. In 1376 Gregory XI, responding to Catherine of Siena's pleas and to political pressure, finally brought the papal court back to Rome. He arrived in January 1377 to find a city barely recognisable as the capital of Christendom. Broken, impoverished, violent, Gregory immediately regretted his decision. He was French, his curia was French, and Rome felt foreign and hostile. He contemplated returning to Avignon, but before he could make that decision, he fell ill and died in March 1378. His death set off a catastrophe that would split the church for decades. The Babylonian captivity was over, but something worse was coming, the Great Schism, when multiple men would claim to be the one true pope, each excommunicating the others, each demanding allegiance from confused and despairing Christians. The cracks that had appeared during the Avignon period were about to break open into chasms. When Gregory XI died in March 1378, the cardinals faced an impossible situation. They were in Rome, where the Roman mob demanded an Italian, or at least a Roman pope, after 70 years of French dominance. But most of the cardinals were French and wanted another French pope, who might return the papacy to Avignon. The conclave met in April 1378 in an atmosphere of intimidation. The cardinals could hear the mob outside. Some reports claim armed men broke into the conclave chambers. The city officials promised to maintain order, but seemed unable or unwilling to control the crowds. Under this pressure, the cardinals elected Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, an Italian, though not a Roman. He took the name Urban VI. The cardinals announced his election, the crowd celebrated, and it seemed the crisis was resolved. But Urban VI immediately revealed himself to be unstable, possibly mentally ill. He was 50 years old, had spent his life in administration, and had never expected to be pope. The power, or perhaps the stress, unhinged him. He began insulting cardinals publicly, calling them corrupt and worldly, which they were, but public denunciation wasn't how the system worked. He announced radical reforms that threatened their incomes and privileges. He physically attacked a cardinal during one argument. He ranted about punishing simony and luxury with imprisonment and execution. The cardinals realised they'd made a catastrophic mistake. By August 1378, most of them had fled Rome. They gathered at Anagni and declared Urban's election invalid. They'd voted under duress from the Roman mob, they claimed, so the election was coerced and therefore illegitimate. They held a new conclave and elected Robert of Geneva, who became Clement VII. Now there were two popes, Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII, who soon moved to Avignon. Each claimed to be the legitimate successor of Peter. Each excommunicated the other. Each demanded obedience from the faithful. Each appointed cardinals, granted benefices, collected revenues, and exercised papal authority. How was an ordinary Christian supposed to navigate this? If you obeyed Urban, Clement declared you excommunicated. If you obeyed Clement, Urban declared you excommunicated. Marriages blessed by one pope's priests might not be valid in the other pope's jurisdiction. Priests ordained by one pope's bishops might not be legitimate clergy according to the other. The sacramental system that held medieval Christianity together was fracturing. Political calculations determined which pope each region supported. France naturally supported the French Clement VII. England, at war with France, supported Urban VI. Scotland, England's enemy, therefore supported Clement. The Italian state split, some supporting Urban, others Clement. Spain initially supported Clement but wavered. The Holy Roman Empire supported Urban. Smaller kingdoms had to choose carefully. The wrong choice might mean losing access to papal dispensations, having bishops go unconfirmed, facing interdicts. Both popes acted as if they were the sole legitimate pontiff. Urban VI created new cardinals to replace those who'd defected to Clement. He remained erratic and violent. At one point he had several cardinals who'd plotted against him arrested, tortured and probably executed, though accounts vary. He died in 1389, possibly poisoned. The Roman cardinals elected a new pope, Boniface IX, continuing the Roman line. Meanwhile, Clement VII died in Avignon in 1394. The Avignon cardinals elected Benedict XIII. So the schism continued with new occupants, but the same basic problem. Two men claiming to be pope, each certain of his legitimacy, neither willing to yield. Calls for resolution grew urgent. Theologians and canon lawyers debated solutions. One approach was the via sessionis, the way of resignation, where both popes would voluntarily resign, allowing a unified church to elect a single successor. But neither pope would agree. Each was convinced he was the true pope, and true popes don't resign. Another approach was via compromissi. Both sides would agree to arbitration by mutually acceptable judges, but whom could both sides accept, and would either really abide by a decision against them? The most radical solution was via concilii, calling a general council of the church that would resolve the issue. But this raised deep theological questions. Could a council depose a pope? Didn't that imply that the council's authority was superior to papal authority? This contradicted centuries of papal supremacy doctrine. Nevertheless, by the early 1400s, enough cardinals from both sides had grown desperate enough to try. In 1409, cardinals from both obediences met at the Council of Pisa. They declared both reigning popes, Gregory XII in Rome and Benedict XIII in Avignon, deposed as schismatics and heretics. They then elected a new pope, Alexander V. This solved nothing. Now there were three popes, Gregory XII and Benedict XIII. Both refused to accept the council's authority and continued ruling their portions of the church. Alexander V had support from the majority, but his legitimacy was questionable. Can cardinals really depose popes? When Alexander V died in 1410, the Pisan cardinals elected John XXIII. Not to be confused with the 20th century Pope John XXIII, the medieval John V was later declared an anti-pope, so his successor could reuse the name. John XXIII was a former pirate and mercenary captain who'd risen through the church hierarchy through military and administrative ability rather than piety. Chroniclers accused him of every vice imaginable: simony, tyranny, heresy, sexual immorality. Whether all these accusations were true is debatable, but John was certainly worldly and ambitious. The chaos had to end. The scandal was destroying the church's credibility. Ordinary people were becoming cynical about the entire system. Heretical movements were gaining ground. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia both argued that the church hierarchy had become so corrupt that individual Christians should rely on scripture and conscience rather than priestly authority. The resolution finally came through the Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418. This was one of the largest church councils ever held, with hundreds of bishops, abbots, and theologians attending. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund played a crucial role, using his political power to force the issue. The council took a radical position. It declared that a general council held authority from Christ himself and could bind everyone, including the Pope. This was conciliarism, the doctrine that council authority was supreme, and it directly contradicted papal supremacy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The council systematically addressed all three popes. John XXIII tried to flee but was captured and forced to resign. Gregory XII, the Roman Pope, agreed to resign on condition that his resignation be framed as voluntary rather than coerced, preserving the principle that popes couldn't be deposed. Benedict XIII, the Avignon Pope, refused to resign and was formally deposed, though he retreated to a Spanish fortress and continued claiming the papacy until his death in 1423. With all three claimants removed or neutralized, the council elected a new pope acceptable to all factions, Oddone Colonna, who became Martin V in November 1417. The Great Schism was finally over. Christianity had a single universally acknowledged pope, but the schism's effects would linger for decades. The papacy's moral authority had been shattered. For nearly 40 years, Christians had watched multiple men claim to be Christ's vicar while excommunicating each other. How could you take papal claims seriously after that? The conciliar movement continued to challenge papal supremacy, and the appetite for church reform, the conviction that the entire system needed radical change, had become overwhelming. The breaking point had passed. The church was unified again, but it was unified on the edge of a precipice, and the long fall into the Reformation was beginning. Martin V's election in 1417 ended the Great Schism, but it didn't restore the papacy's lost authority. If anything, the next century would see popes behave in ways that made the medieval scandals look almost quaint by comparison. These were the Renaissance popes, and they transformed the papacy into something barely recognisable as a Christian institution. Martin V himself was relatively restrained. His main focus was rebuilding Rome after decades of neglect. But he established a pattern that his successors would follow. He treated the papacy primarily as an Italian political power, a temporal state among other temporal states, and his policies prioritised territorial expansion and family advancement over spiritual leadership. The transition was gradual at first. Eugene IV, 1431 to 1447, spent much of his reign fighting with the Council of Basel, which tried to assert conciliar supremacy over papal authority. Eugene eventually won, but the fight demonstrated how fragile papal authority remained. Nicholas V, 1447 to 1455, was a humanist and scholar who founded the Vatican Library and began the transformation of Rome into a Renaissance city. He was relatively decent by papal standards, though he still practiced nepotism and lived luxuriously. Then came Calixtus III, 1455 to 1458, born Alfonso de Borgia. He was elderly when elected, 77 years old, and spent his brief reign advancing his family's fortunes. He made his nephew Rodrigo a cardinal at age 25 and gave him lucrative church offices. This nephew would later become one of history's most notorious popes. But first came Pius II, 1458 to 1464, born Enea Silvio Piccolomini. Before becoming pope, he'd been a diplomat, poet and author of erotic literature. His transformation from worldly humanist to reforming pope was genuine but incomplete. He retained his love of learning and beauty while trying to organise a crusade against the Ottoman Turks, who'd captured Constantinople in 1453. His crusade failed. He died at Ancona waiting for the Crusader fleet that never came. Paul II, 1464 to 1471, was vain and pleasure-loving, who were building a magnificent palazzo and collecting art and jewellery. Sixtus IV, 1471 to 1484, practiced nepotism on an unprecedented scale, making 6 of his nephews cardinals and involving the papacy in Italian wars. He helped plan the Pazzi conspiracy that tried to murder Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother during Mass in Florence Cathedral. Lorenzo survived, his brother didn't, and Florence went to war with the papacy. Sixtus also built the Sistine Chapel, which bears his name, though Michelangelo's famous ceiling wouldn't be painted until the next century. Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children. Sources vary, but he had at least 2, possibly as many as 8. He threw lavish weddings for them in the Vatican, with cardinals in attendance. He sold church offices blatantly, creating new positions simply to sell them. He made a boy of 13 a cardinal because the boy's father paid 30,000 ducats. But all of these popes pale compared to Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. Alexander VI's election was itself corrupt. He bribed cardinals with gold offices and promises. This wasn't subtle backroom dealing. Contemporaries openly talked about which cardinals had been bought and for how much. The Milanese ambassador reported, "The Pope's election was notorious for simony." They were right. Alexander had lived openly with his mistress, Vanozza de Catanei, before becoming pope, and had 4 acknowledged children with her, Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia and Joffre. He didn't abandon them when he became pope. Instead, he made them central to his reign. Cesare Borgia became a cardinal at age 18, though he had no religious vocation whatsoever. When his older brother Juan was murdered, possibly by Cesare himself, though this was never proven, Cesare resigned the cardinalate and became a military commander. Alexander helped him carve out a principality in central Italy through warfare and assassination. Machiavelli later used Cesare as the model for his book The Prince, praising his ruthless effectiveness. Lucrezia Borgia was married 3 times in political alliances arranged by her father. The first marriage was annulled when the political situation changed. The second husband was murdered, probably on Cesare's orders, when that alliance became inconvenient. The third marriage to the Duke of Ferrara lasted because it remained politically useful. The rumours about Alexander's relationship with Lucrezia were lurid and probably exaggerated. Contemporaries accused them of incest, but these accusations came from political enemies and should be treated skeptically. What's certain is that Alexander treated his children as political tools and was willing to destroy anyone who threatened them. The famous banquet of chestnuts supposedly occurred in October 1501 in the papal palace. According to Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies who kept detailed diaries, 50 prostitutes danced naked before the Pope and his family, then crawled on hands and knees, picking up chestnuts scattered on the floor, followed by an orgy. Burchard's account is explicit and disgusting. Whether it actually happened as described is debated. Burchard sometimes embellished, and he disliked the Borgias, but the fact that such stories could be told and believed reveals how far papal reputation had fallen. Alexander waged wars, made and broke alliances, poisoned enemies, or was accused of poisoning them, and accumulated enormous wealth. When he died suddenly in August 1503, probably from malaria though many suspected poison, Rome erupted in celebration. Cesare's enemies immediately attacked him. He lost his territories and eventually died in battle in Spain. Lucrezia survived, living quietly in Ferrara until 1519. The Borgia dynasty vanished as quickly as it had risen. He personally led military campaigns, wearing armour, and directing sieges. He drove foreign powers out of Italy through the League of Cambrai and the Holy League. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to fresco the papal apartments. He laid the cornerstone for the new St. Peter's Basilica. He was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly absorbed in temporal power and artistic patronage rather than spiritual leadership. Whether he actually said this is disputed, but it captures his reign perfectly. He loved hunting, gambling, elaborate theatrical performances, and banquets. He spent money faster than even the papal treasury could supply it. To raise funds, he greatly expanded the sale of indulgences across Europe, particularly in Germany. This sale of indulgences, the promise that you could buy a reduced purgatory time for yourself or deceased relatives, finally provoked Martin Luther. On October 31, 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses criticising indulgence sales on the door of the Wittenberg church. This sparked the Protestant Reformation, which would split Western Christianity permanently. Leotek didn't take Luther seriously at first. "Luther is a drunken German," he reportedly said. By the time Leo realised the danger, it was too late. The Reformation was spreading across northern Europe. The breaking point had arrived. The Renaissance popes had achieved a kind of magnificence. Rome became beautiful again, filled with artistic masterpieces that we still treasure. But they'd done so at the cost of the church's soul. They'd proven that the papacy could be utterly corrupt and still function as an institution. But they'd also demonstrated that there were limits to what Christians would tolerate. The transformation was complete. The papacy had declined from spiritual authority to temporal power, from successor of Peter to Renaissance prince. What remained to be seen was whether it could find its way back. The Protestant Reformation tore Europe apart. Within decades of Luther's 95 Theses, half of Christian Europe had rejected papal authority. England broke with Rome entirely, creating the Anglican Church. German princes used Lutheranism to assert independence from both Pope and Emperor. Calvin established a theocratic republic in Geneva. Scandinavia went Lutheran. Parts of Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Scotland embraced various forms of Reformed Protestantism. But the Catholic Church didn't simply collapse. Instead, it underwent its own Reformation. Historians call it the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation, that transformed it almost as dramatically as the Protestant movement transformed Northern Europe. The Council of Trent, meeting intermittently from 1545 to 1563, was the centrepiece of this transformation. Unlike the medieval councils we discussed earlier, Trent didn't deal with rival popes or schisms. Instead, it systematically addressed the Protestant critiques and Reformed Catholic practice. On doctrine, Trent was uncompromising. It reaffirmed transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood during Mass. It defended the seven sacraments against Protestant reductions. But on discipline and practice, Trent enacted sweeping reforms. The selling of indulgences was sharply restricted and regulated. The standards for bishops were tightened. They had to reside in their dioceses, not treat them as sinecures while living elsewhere. Seminaries were established to properly train priests, replacing the haphazard education that had prevailed. Clerical celibacy was vigorously enforced. The practice of selling church offices was formally abolished, though it continued in diminished form. Most importantly, the notion of what a pope should be began to change. The popes of the late 16th and 17th centuries were generally serious, devout men who took their spiritual responsibilities seriously. They weren't saints. Paul IV was a bigot who established the Roman ghetto for Jews, and Urban VIII engaged in shameless nepotism. but they weren't the Borgias or the Medicis either. New religious orders emerged that embodied the Reformed spirit. The Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola and approved in 1540, became the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. Rigorously educated, spiritually disciplined, obedient to the Pope, they established schools and missions across the globe. They went to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, spreading Catholicism to places that had never heard of Rome. Francis Xavier evangelized India and Japan. Matteo Ricci brought Christianity to China. The Jesuit missions in Paraguay created unique communities that blended European Christianity with indigenous culture. The Capuchins, a reformed branch of the Franciscans, emphasized poverty and service to the poor. The Oratorians, founded by Philip Neri, worked to reform clergy through prayer and education. The Ursulines provided education for girls. These orders represented a genuine renewal of religious commitment within Catholicism. The Catholic Church also became more centralized and bureaucratic, ironically making it more efficient but also more rigid. The Roman Inquisition was strengthened to combat heresy. The Index of Forbidden Books was created to control what Catholics could read. Catholic kingdoms enforced religious uniformity through violence, the Spanish Inquisition, the French Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War that devastated Central Europe. But alongside this violence and rigidity came authentic spirituality. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross reformed the Carmelite order and wrote profound mystical works. Francis de Sales wrote Introduction to the Devout Life, teaching that ordinary people, not just monks and nuns, could pursue holiness. Vincent de Paul founded the Vincentians to serve the poor. Baroque art transformed Catholic churches. While Protestant churches became plain, emphasizing the word preached from the pulpit, Catholic churches became theatrical spaces designed to inspire awe and devotion. Bernini's sculptures, Caravaggio's paintings, the elaborate facades and soaring domes, all aimed to make the divine tangible, to overwhelm the senses and lift the soul toward God. The papacy itself stabilized. There were no more condottieri popes leading armies, no more open acknowledgement of papal children. The conclave system was refined to reduce the possibility of blatant simony. Popes became more isolated, surrounded by elaborate ceremony, treated as semi-divine figures rather than temporal princes. This isolation had its own problems. It made popes less aware of what ordinary Christians experienced, but it also protected the office's dignity. By 1600, the map of Christian Europe was set and would remain essentially unchanged for centuries. Catholic in the south, Italy, Spain, Portugal, southern Germany, Austria, Poland, parts of France. Protestant in the north, Scandinavia, northern Germany, parts of Switzerland, Scotland. Mixed in the middle, France torn between Catholic and Huguenot. The Netherlands split between Protestant north and Catholic south. England officially Protestant, but with a large Catholic minority. The papacy had survived. It ruled a smaller spiritual empire, but that empire was more disciplined, more devout, more united in its opposition to Protestantism. The scandals that had enabled the Reformation, the simony, the sexual corruption, the worldly ambition, had been substantially reduced if not eliminated. What remained was an institution that had learned, through catastrophe, what it needed to be. Not a temporal power competing with kings and emperors, but a spiritual authority leading a global church. Not Renaissance princes patronizing artists while ignoring theology, but successors of Peter shepherding souls toward salvation. The wild, violent, scandalous medieval papacy was over. Something more sober, more serious, more genuinely religious had emerged from its ashes. How did later generations remember the scandalous popes? How did their stories get retold, transformed, and used for various purposes? This is where history becomes legend and fact mingles with interpretation. Protestant polemicists naturally used the medieval papal scandals extensively. They needed to justify their break from Rome, and what better justification than pointing to the Borgias and their predecessors? Luther himself frequently referenced corrupt popes in his writings. The whore of Babylon from the Book of Revelation became, in Protestant interpretation, the papacy itself, dressed in scarlet, drunk on the blood of martyrs, the embodiment of corruption. But these Protestant accounts often exaggerated. Every bad story got repeated, embellished, made worse. The rumours became facts, the possibilities became certainties. This was propaganda, not history, though it was effective propaganda. For centuries, Protestants knew that the medieval popes were monsters, and this knowledge justified their separation from Rome. Catholic historians took the opposite approach. They minimized the scandals, explained them away, or simply ignored them. Yes, there had been some bad popes, they admitted, but these were aberrations, individual failings that didn't reflect on the institution itself. The Catholic Church's continuity was what mattered, not the temporary corruptions of particular occupants of Peter's throne. Some Catholic apologists went further, questioning the evidence itself, those scandalous accounts. Might they have been written by enemies, exaggerated for effect, based on rumours rather than facts? This approach had some validity. We really don't know, for instance, whether the banquet of chestnuts actually happened as described. We rely on one source, Johannes Burchard, and he had reasons to portray the Borgias badly. But the apologetic approach could go too far, becoming dishonest. There really were terrible popes. The Great Schism really did happen. These weren't just Protestant inventions. Admitting this became important for Catholic intellectual honesty. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as history became more professional and less polemical, historians tried to understand the medieval papacy in context rather than simply condemning or defending it. What social and political conditions produced these scandals? How did medieval people themselves view their popes? Were they shocked by behaviour that shocks us? Or did they have different expectations? This contextual approach revealed complexity. Medieval Christians didn't necessarily think the Pope's personal morality affected his sacramental authority. If a bad Pope ordained a priest, that priest was still truly ordained. If he celebrated Mass, Christ was still truly present in the Eucharist. The medieval distinction between the office and the man holding the office was more robust than we might expect. This doesn't mean medieval people approved of scandalous popes. The sources are full of criticism. Dante putting popes in hell, Petrarch denouncing Avignon, reformers calling for change, but they criticised while still accepting papal authority, something that seems almost contradictory to modern minds. The stories of individual scandalous popes took on lives of their own in literature and popular culture. The Borgias especially became legendary. They appear in Victor Hugo's play Lucrezia Borgia, in numerous novels and in recent television series. The historical Borgias were bad enough, but the legendary Borgias became arch-villains, poisoning everyone who crossed them, engaging in every conceivable vice. The reality was more complex, and in some ways more interesting than the legend. Benedict IX, despite being perhaps objectively worse than Alexander VI, he was Pope 3 separate times, after all, and sold the papacy, never achieved the same legendary status. Why? Perhaps because his reign lacked the Renaissance glamour of the Borgias. Perhaps because he lived too early to be well documented. Or perhaps because his story is too complicated to make good drama. 3 separate reigns, multiple anti-popes, complex church politics. The Borgias' story is cleaner. Corruption, power, incest, poison, followed by dramatic collapse. The medieval papacy's scandals also became useful in later church politics. During the First Vatican Council in 1870, when papal infallibility was being debated, both sides referenced history. Opponents of infallibility pointed to heretical or immoral popes. How could the Church declare popes infallible when history showed them to be so fallible? Supporters argued that infallibility applied only to formal doctrinal definitions, not to personal morality or most papal decisions. The doctrine passed, but in a more limited form than some had wanted. In the 21st century, during the clerical sex abuse crisis, comparisons to the medieval papacy's scandals became common. Some argued that the Church had survived corrupt Renaissance popes and would survive this too. Others argued that this was precisely the problem. The Church had learned to survive scandals without truly addressing their root causes. The memory of scandalous popes serves different purposes for different people. For some, it's evidence that human institutions inevitably become corrupt and need constant reformation. For others, it demonstrates the Church's resilience, that even terrible leadership couldn't destroy an institution founded on spiritual truth. For still others, it's simply fascinating history, the human drama of power and failure writ large on the stage of European civilization. What actually survived from the medieval papacy? Certainly not most of its claims to temporal power. The papal states lasted until 1870, but were always precarious, and modern popes rule only tiny Vatican City. The claim to supremacy over secular rulers is dead. No modern pope could excommunicate a president or declare a king deposed, but the spiritual authority survived, at least within Catholicism. The Pope is still supreme pontiff, still claims to be Peter's successor, still makes pronouncements that Catholics consider binding. The office's survival through centuries of scandal is remarkable. Perhaps it suggests divine protection, as Catholics believe. Or perhaps it demonstrates that institutions, once established and supported by vast networks of belief and practice, can survive almost anything. The medieval papacy's legacy is paradoxical, an institution that claimed perfection while demonstrating profound imperfection, that survived by adapting after refusing to adapt, that was destroyed and reborn without ever technically ending. The scandals became part of the story, not separate from it. Lessons about what happens when spiritual authority meets worldly power, when human weakness inhabits divine office. How do we know what we know about the scandalous popes? The sources are fragmentary, biased, and often contradictory. Modern historians work like detectives, piecing together evidence from multiple types of sources, always aware that each source has its own agenda. The papal registers, official records of letters, appointments, and decisions, survive in surprising quantity in the Vatican secret archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives. These massive volumes contain tens of thousands of documents spanning centuries. They're invaluable for understanding papal administration, but they're official records. They tell us what the papacy wanted to document, not necessarily what actually happened. Chronicles written by contemporaries provide narrative accounts but are often wildly biased. Liutprand of Cremona, whose accounts of 10th century popes we've referenced, hated the people he was writing about and clearly embellished. Does this make his accounts useless? No, but we have to read them critically, extracting what seems plausible and discounting obvious exaggeration. Letters provide more intimate glimpses. Catherine of Siena's letters to popes are genuine and revealing, showing both her respect for the office and her willingness to criticize its occupants. Petrarch's letters from Avignon, while polemical, capture the atmosphere of the 14th century papal court. Diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms often mentions popes and papal policy, providing outside perspectives. Council records are crucial for understanding crises like the Great Schism. The debates and decisions at Constance, meticulously recorded, reveal how the Church struggled with seemingly impossible problems. Who had authority? Could councils depose popes? These records show the Church leaders working through questions that had no clear answers. Financial records survive in surprising detail. The Avignon Papacy's revenue accounts, its payment registers, its lists of fees, these documents reveal the machinery of papal finance in stark detail. Modern historians have used them to calculate exactly how much money John XXI accumulated, where it came from, and what happened to it. Archaeological evidence provides physical context. Excavations in Rome have revealed how the city declined during the Avignon period and was rebuilt during the Renaissance. The papal palaces at Avignon still stand, their scale and luxury evident. Churches, tombs, art commissioned by popes, all these physical remnants tell stories. Art historical analysis reveals papal self-presentation. How did popes choose to be depicted? What messages did they want to send? The transition from medieval to Renaissance papal imagery is striking. Early medieval popes appear as simple bishops, Renaissance popes as magnificent princes. Modern papal archives have gradually opened to scholars, though significant restrictions remain. In 2020, Pope Francis opened the archives of Pius XII's reign, 1939 to 1958, to researchers, setting off new debates about Vatican policy during the Holocaust. Earlier archives have been available longer, allowing detailed studies of medieval popes, but significant mysteries remain. We still don't know, for instance, who killed Pope John XII, or if he died naturally. We don't know how many children some popes actually had. Rumours and facts are hopelessly tangled. We don't know the full extent of some popes' wealth because they hid assets. We don't know what was discussed at many crucial conclaves because secrecy oaths were taken seriously. Historians continue to debate fundamental questions. Was the medieval papacy's corruption primarily a problem of individuals or of systems? Could the institution have reformed itself without the Protestant shock? Were the reforming popes genuinely pious or simply better at managing appearances? New methodologies yield new insights. Prosopography, the study of collective biography, has been used to analyse who became cardinals, where they came from, how they were related to popes and each other. This reveals the network structures underlying medieval papal politics. Statistical analysis of financial records shows patterns in revenue collection and spending. Comparative studies place the papacy alongside other medieval institutions, showing how it was both unique and typical of its era. Gender history has raised new questions about women's roles. The infamous Pope Joan legend, claiming that a woman disguised as a man became pope in the 9th century, is certainly false, but it reveals anxieties about women and power. More seriously, examining women like Theodora, Marozia, and Catherine of Siena shows how women exercise power in and around the papacy, even while being excluded from its offices. Economic history has reframed our understanding of papal corruption. The buying and selling of offices wasn't just personal greed, it was how medieval institutions financed themselves. The church couldn't tax like kingdoms could, so it monetized its spiritual authority. This doesn't excuse the practice, but it explains it as a systemic problem rather than individual vice. Religious history has become more sophisticated about belief and practice. Medieval Christians didn't simply obey or disobey corrupt popes. They navigated complex situations, finding ways to maintain their faith while acknowledging institutional failures. Popular religion, how ordinary people actually practiced Christianity, often differed significantly from official doctrine. Digital humanities are now transforming medieval studies. Databases of papal documents allow researchers to search and analyze in ways previously impossible. Network analysis can map connections between popes, cardinals, and powerful families. Geographic information systems can visualize how papal authority varied across Europe. What surprises still await in the archives? The Vatican continues to restrict access to some materials, particularly those from recent centuries. What will future openings reveal? Will they confirm what we think we know, or overturn current understanding? One thing modern research has definitely shown: the scandalous popes weren't aberrations in an otherwise pure institution. They were products of a system that mixed spiritual authority with temporal power, that rewarded political skill over holiness, that allowed noble families to treat church office as property. Understanding them requires understanding their world, its assumptions, its logic, its possibilities and constraints. The medieval papacy wasn't simply corrupt, it was operating by different rules than we recognize today. Modern distinctions between church and state, public and private, sacred and secular, these weren't medieval categories. Popes were simultaneously bishops and princes, spiritual leaders and temporal rulers, and the resulting contradictions couldn't be resolved until the system itself fundamentally changed. That change, when it came through Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation, didn't erase the scandalous popes from history. It couldn't, but it tried to ensure they would have no successors. Let's step back now from the specific popes and specific scandals to think about what this history reveals about power, faith, and human nature. First, there's the persistent question of what happens when spiritual authority accumulates temporal power. The papacy started as a simple bishopric. The Bishop of Rome was just one important Christian leader among several. But as the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Rome became vulnerable, the bishop had to become more than a spiritual figure. He had to organize food distribution, negotiate with invaders, and govern the city. This wasn't corruption, it was survival. But once that temporal power was established, it grew according to its own logic. Temporal power requires resources, money, soldiers, territory, and acquiring these requires political maneuvering, war, taxation. Before long, the spiritual mission becomes subordinated to maintaining the power structure. The means becomes the end. This pattern appears across religious history. Whenever religious institutions gain significant worldly power, they tend to become corrupted by it. Buddhist monasteries in medieval Japan accumulated land and armies. Islamic caliphates became dynastic empires indistinguishable from secular kingdoms. The pattern is universal because the problem is structural, not specific to Christianity or to the papacy. But here's what's interesting about the Catholic response. They solved it not by eliminating papal authority, but by separating spiritual from temporal power. The modern papacy has almost no temporal power. Vatican City is tiny, symbolic. Yet papal spiritual authority, at least within Catholicism, remains strong, perhaps stronger than when popes commanded armies and ruled territories. This suggests that spiritual authority actually increases when divorced from worldly power, something many religious reformers have argued. Second, this history reveals something about institutional resilience and fragility. The medieval papacy survived scandals that should have destroyed it. Benedict IX selling the papacy, 3 rival popes during the Great Schism, the Borgias, any of these should have been fatal, yet the institution endured. Why? Partly because it served functions that people needed. The church-organized society provided meaning, offered hope for salvation. Even when individual popes were corrupt, the local priest might be devout, the monastery might serve the poor, the sacraments might still feel sacred. The institution was bigger than its leaders. But there were limits. When corruption became too blatant, when the gap between Christian ideals and papal reality became too wide, the institution fractured. The Protestant Reformation was that breaking point. Luther didn't create the crisis, he articulated frustrations that a million shared. This suggests that institutions can survive enormous corruption if they're meeting fundamental needs, but they can't survive indefinitely. There's a tipping point where cynicism overwhelms habit, where people stop believing in the institution's legitimacy even if they continue participating in its rituals. Third, this history shows how reform movements emerge from within corrupted institutions. Gregory VII, Francis of Assisi, Catherine of Siena, Ignatius of Loyola. These reformers didn't reject the church, but called it back to its founding principles. They combined fierce criticism with deep loyalty, demanding that the institution live up to its own ideals. This internal reform tradition has parallels in other contexts. Every enduring institution develops critics who are also believers, people who care enough to demand better. When these reform movements gain traction, institutions can transform dramatically. When they're suppressed or ignored, the institution either stagnates or faces external revolution. The Catholic Counter-Reformation succeeded where many reform movements failed because it was comprehensive. It didn't just demand that individuals behave better, it changed structures, created new institutions, established new standards. The seminaries, the religious orders, the Council of Trent, these weren't just good intentions but concrete changes that made different outcomes possible. Fourth, this history illuminates the gap between office and person. Medieval Christians distinguished between a pope's official authority and his personal conduct. A bad pope could still validly ordain priests, consecrate bishops, and celebrate Mass. The sacraments worked ex opere operato, by the work being performed, not because of the celebrant's worthiness. This distinction seems strange to modern sensibilities. We tend to think character matters more than title. If someone is corrupt, why should we accept their authority? But the medieval view had logic. If sacramental validity depended on priestly worthiness, how could anyone be sure their baptism was valid, their confession heard, their marriage legitimate? The system required a separation between office and person. But this distinction also enabled corruption. If personal conduct didn't matter, why should popes restrain themselves? If the office protected them from consequences, what incentive did they have to be holy rather than merely politically successful? Modern democratic societies have partly solved this by making office holders removable. If you're corrupt, you lose office. But religions resist this solution because they're not democracies. They claim divine sanction for their structures. How do you remove a leader who claims to speak for God? Fifth, this history reveals how narratives shape identity. Catholic identity was partly forged by these scandals, not because Catholics approved of corrupt popes, but because defending the institution despite bad leaders became a mark of true faith. The Church was more than its current occupants. It was 2,000 years of tradition, doctrine, and spiritual presence. Protestant identity was similarly shaped by these scandals, but negatively. The corrupt popes justified separation, proved that Rome had fallen away from true Christianity. The narrative of decline and necessary reform became central to Protestant self-understanding. Both narratives contained truth and distortion. The popes really were often corrupt, but the medieval church was also more vital, more creative, and more genuinely spiritual than the Protestant narrative acknowledged. And papal authority really did rest on more than individual worthiness. But Rome's defenders often minimized real problems. Sixth, this history shows the complex relationship between corruption and creativity. The Renaissance popes were terrible by Christian standards, worldly, ambitious, violent, but they also patronized some of humanity's greatest art. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's frescoes, Bernini's sculptures, the new St. Peter's Basilica, all funded by popes who should have been spending that money on charity and spiritual renewal. Was this worth it? Should those artistic treasures have been sacrificed for more pious papal behaviour? There's no simple answer. The art has brought beauty and inspiration to billions across 5 centuries. The corruption caused immense suffering and spiritual damage. Both consequences are real. This tension appears throughout history, between purity and achievement, Between moral integrity and cultural brilliance, sometimes corrupt systems produce extraordinary works. Sometimes rigorous virtue produces rigidity and sterility. There's no formula for resolving this tension. Finally, this history reminds us that scandal and reform are part of an ongoing cycle, not a story with a clear ending. The medieval scandals provoked the Counter-Reformation, which cleaned up papal behaviour for a while. But new scandals eventually emerged: the Vatican's role during the Holocaust, financial corruption in the Vatican Bank, the clerical sex abuse crisis. Each generation faces its own version of the fundamental problem: how to maintain institutional integrity while wielding institutional power. The medieval papacy's scandals aren't just historical curiosities, they're case studies in eternal questions about authority, power, faith, and reform. They show us both how bad things can get and how institutions can survive and change. They remind us that no institution is beyond corruption, but also that no corruption is necessarily final. The patterns we see in medieval papal history appear in governments, corporations, universities, and other churches. The specific details differ, but the underlying dynamics, the accumulation of power, the rationalization of corruption, the resistance of entrenched interests, the emergence of reform movements, these recur across contexts. Understanding the scandalous popes, then, isn't just about understanding medieval history. It's about understanding how institutions work, how they fail, and how they can be reformed. It's about recognizing that people are complex, that organizations are complex, and that simple stories of good versus evil rarely capture reality. The medieval popes were neither demons nor saints. They were human beings operating in systems that shaped their choices and constrained their options while still leaving room for agency and moral judgment. Some chose well, some chose poorly. All face situations more complicated than our judgments from centuries later can fully capture. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson. History is not a morality play but a record of human complexity, demanding understanding before judgment. Here we are, then, at the end of our journey through the scandalous popes of the Middle Ages. The room where you're sitting has probably grown darker as we've talked. Perhaps you've lit a lamp, or perhaps you're content to sit in twilight, letting the day fade while these old stories settle in your mind. We've travelled from the ruined Rome of the 10th century, where dogs ran through broken forums and powerful women made and unmade popes at will, all the way to the Renaissance magnificence of the Borgias and Medicis, and finally to the Reformed Church that emerged from the Protestant challenge. We've met murderers and saints, sometimes finding them uncomfortably close together, sometimes occupying the same troubled soul. What strikes me most looking back across this whole sprawling story is the persistence of both corruption and faith. The corruption was real. We haven't exaggerated it. Benedict IX really did sell the papacy. Alexander VI really did father multiple children and advance them through nepotism and violence. But faith persisted too. Through all the scandals, Christians continued believing, praying, seeking salvation. Monks in remote monasteries copied manuscripts and preserved learning. Parish priests heard confessions and baptized children. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to visit holy sites. The mystical tradition flourished even while the institutional church floundered. Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, and countless others found profound encounters with the divine despite, or perhaps because of, the church's earthly corruption. This tells us something important about the nature of religious faith. It's more resilient than institutions, more adaptable than hierarchies. People found ways to be Christian even when Christianity's most visible representatives were failing spectacularly. They distinguished between the eternal truths they believed in and the temporal failures they witnessed. There's something both beautiful and troubling in this. Beautiful because it shows human resilience and the genuine power of spiritual conviction. Troubling because it raises the question: if faith can survive such terrible leadership, does leadership matter at all? If the church endures despite corrupt popes, what incentive is there for popes to be holy? The Protestant reformers answered decisively: leadership does matter, institutions do matter, and when they become too corrupt, you must leave and build anew. Their answer transformed European Christianity permanently. The Catholic response was equally decisive but different. Leadership matters, institutions matter, and when they become corrupt, you must reform them from within, preserving continuity while demanding change. Both responses had validity. Both produced genuine spiritual renewal. Both also produced their own problems. Protestant fragmentation into thousands of competing denominations, Catholic rigidity, and resistance to further change. There are no perfect solutions, only different ways of managing the eternal tension between ideals and reality. As I think about the individuals we've discussed, the popes with their ambitions and failures, the reformers with their courage and sometimes fanaticism, the ordinary believers trying to navigate impossible situations, I'm struck by how recognizable they are. Strip away the medieval clothing and circumstances, and you find people facing dilemmas we still face. What do you do when leaders you're supposed to respect behave contemptibly? How do you remain loyal to an institution while acknowledging its failures? When do you work for reform from within, and when do you walk away? How do you balance ideals with practical necessities? These weren't just medieval questions, they're human questions, recurring in every generation. The medieval papacy's scandals also remind us that progress isn't inevitable. The papacy of Gregory the Great in the 6th century was, in many ways, more spiritually serious than the papacy of John XII in the 10th century. The reform papacy of Leo IX in the 11th century was more admirable than the Renaissance papacy of Alexander VI in the 15th. History doesn't move in a straight line from worse to better. It cycles, it regresses, it advances and retreats. But neither is progress impossible. The post-Reformation papacy really did improve on its medieval predecessor. The structural changes, ending the sale of offices, requiring clerical celibacy, removing popes from direct temporal rule, made certain kinds of corruption much less likely. Systems matter. Institutions can learn. The question is whether they learn quickly enough, whether reform comes before catastrophe or only after. The medieval papacy waited too long. Reform came only after half of Europe had broken away. The price of delayed reform was schism, war, and the deaths of millions in the religious conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. This has resonance today, not just for religious institutions, but for all institutions that claim authority while resisting accountability. Governments, corporations, universities, any organization that accumulates power faces the same risk. Reform while you can, or face revolution when you must. There's also something profound about the way these stories have been remembered and retold across centuries. The scandalous popes became legendary precisely because they violated what the office was supposed to be. If popes were expected to be worldly rulers, their behavior wouldn't have shocked anyone. The scandal existed because the gap between expectation and reality was so vast. This means the corruption paradoxically testified to the ideals. People wouldn't have been outraged by papal mistresses if they didn't believe popes should be celibate. They wouldn't have condemned simony if they didn't believe church office should go to the worthy rather than the wealthy. Even the harshest critics were, in a sense, affirming what the papacy ought to be by condemning what it had become. The art that emerged from this era, from Dante's Divine Comedy placing popes in hell to the magnificent but troubling splendour of Renaissance Rome, continues to speak to us because it grapples with these fundamental tensions. How do we respond to failed authority? How do we maintain faith when institutions betray it? How do we judge people operating in systems we can barely imagine? Walking through the Vatican museums today, you see both sides of this story. The artistic achievements are breathtaking, proof of what human creativity can accomplish when given resources and freedom. But those resources came from the very corruption we've been discussing. The gold that paid Michelangelo came partly from selling indulgences to desperate believers who thought they were buying their relatives out of purgatory. Can we admire the art while condemning how it was funded? Should we? There's no simple answer. History is messy, and our responses to it must be complex enough to match that messiness. I think about Catherine of Siena, that remarkable woman who wrote to popes demanding they return to Rome and reform their lives. She called them Father, with genuine respect while telling them bluntly how they were failing. She embodied both loyalty and criticism, both reverence for the office and condemnation of its occupant. Her example shows how to engage with flawed institutions, neither blind obedience nor complete rejection, but critical engagement born of genuine love. Or think of Thomas More, a devout Catholic who died rather than accept Henry VIII's break with Rome, even though he recognized papal corruption. He chose martyrdom for an imperfect church because he believed the church was more than its current leaders. His choice seems almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Why die for an institution you know is corrupt? but more distinguished between the eternal church and its temporal failures, and that distinction mattered enough to die for. Or consider Luther himself, who didn't want to split the church but felt compelled to by his conscience. He saw the corruption, articulated the alternative, and then watched as his movement spiraled beyond his control into something more radical than he'd intended. Reformers rarely get to control what comes after them. These individuals, popes and critics, saints and sinners, remind us that history is made by specific people making specific choices in specific moments. Systems matter, structures matter, but so do individuals and their moral courage or moral failure. As we close this long meditation on scandal and power, faith and corruption, I want to emphasize that I'm not offering simple lessons or tidy conclusions. The medieval papacy's story is too vast, too complex, too filled with contradictions for that. Instead, I'm offering you questions to carry with you. How do we maintain critical engagement with institutions we value? How do we balance tradition with the need for reform? When do we stay and fight? When do we leave? How do we judge people operating under different assumptions and constraints than our own? What do we preserve from flawed pasts, and what do we rightly leave behind? These questions don't have universal answers. They depend on context, on the specific institution, on what's at stake, but they're worth asking, worth wrestling with, because the patterns we've seen in medieval papal history, the corruption of power, the resistance to reform, the eventual reckoning, these patterns appear everywhere. The scandalous popes lived and died centuries ago. Their palaces are museums now, their scandals transformed into history lessons. But the forces that produced them, human ambition, institutional inertia, the intoxication of power, the difficulty of reform, these remain as current as tomorrow's headlines. Perhaps that's why these stories still fascinate us. They're not just about the past, but about permanent features of human social life. They show us our capacity for corruption and our capacity for renewal, our ability to tolerate the intolerable, and our eventual insistence on change. The medieval church was wounded by these scandals but survived them. It was transformed but maintained continuity. It lost much but preserved something essential. Whether you see this as evidence of divine protection or institutional resilience, or simply historical accident, depends on your perspective. All three may contain some truth. What I know is this: the story of the scandalous popes is ultimately a human story. It's about power and how it corrupts, about faith and how it persists, about institutions and how they evolve. It's about the gap between what we aspire to be and what we actually become, and about the painful, necessary work of closing that gap. Thank you for walking this long road with me, through centuries of scandal and reform, corruption and renewal. I hope these stories have given you not just knowledge, but understanding. Understanding of a complex past, of human nature, of how institutions work and fail and sometimes, against all odds, find their way back to their founding purpose. The light has faded now. Evening has deepened into night. But we've traced a path from darkness to darkness with moments of illumination between, which is perhaps what all history does. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it, carrying its lessons into our own imperfect present as we try to build something better for the future. Where are you listening from tonight? Whatever your answer, whatever brought you to this story, I hope you found something valuable in these medieval tales of power and faith, scandal and renewal. The past speaks to us if we listen carefully enough, not giving us answers but asking us the right questions. And those questions about power, faith, corruption and reform, they're yours now to wrestle with, as every generation must. Rest well, friend. History continues tomorrow.